Thank you, Chair. Good day, everyone. My name is Sonnylal, and I'm from the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. Today, Dr. Jasmira Wiersma and myself will be going through our research, which was also co-authored by my colleague, Miguel, who is here with us today, entitled Fostering Bilateral Trade Between Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago, an Empirical Investigation of Country Comparative Advantage. Now, our both institutions thought it very fitting that this piece of collaborative research be presented at this particular conference that brings together economists and central banks with a shared Caribbean vision, and most especially to discuss bilateral trade. Now, for today's presentation, I will take us through the introduction to data and methodology, followed which Jasmira will go through the results and analysis and conclusion and recommendations. Given the small and open nature of Caribbean economies, each of us cannot go it alone. Regional integration has emerged as a key strategy for economic growth, leading to the negotiation of several intra-regional trade agreements. In one of the more recent moves towards expanding regional integration, Curaçao became an associate member of CARICOM in July 2024. Among the various aspects of this new relationship, it has prompted efforts to broaden trade ties, including the negotiation of a partial scope trade agreement with Trinidad and Tobago. And it is in this vein that both institutions wanted to hit the ground running in exploring what this could mean. Now, the success of any trade agreement requires an understanding of each country's trade structures. It requires an understanding of the goods and services that each of us produces and exports efficiently, known as comparative advantage, and how this now aligns with the import needs of the partner, known as trade complementarity. As the trade relationship between both countries deepens, we wanted to explore this dynamic. So we undertook an empirical investigation of bilateral trade potential, focusing on mutually beneficial goods and services. And this will be done by focusing on revealed comparative advantage, trade complementarity, and import intensity. You will repeatedly hear us mention comparative advantage. And while we all know what this is, what is comparative advantage? Introduced by David Ricardo in the 1800s, comparative advantage states that countries should specialize in products that they produce at a lower opportunity cost. Therefore, specialization based on comparative advantage leads to mutual gains from trade. And even though comparative advantage is difficult to observe, it can be measured using an index for revealed comparative advantage. So the Balasa 1965 index is one such measure that looks at export performance. It is a simple and intuitive measure with a range from 0 to infinity, where if the index is more than 1, comparative advantage, less than 1, comparative disadvantage. Regionally, Lord Francis and Elaine in 2006 explored this, the export performance of Caribbean economies using the Balasa index over 1992 to 2006. And what they found is that Caribbean economies tend to have comparative advantages in food and beverages, tobacco, crude materials, which are basically your traditional sectors, agriculture and energy. And we will see some of that coming out of our own study. Now, comparative advantage does not guarantee mutually beneficial trade. Trade complementarity addresses this gap. So what it does, it aligns the export structure of one economy to the import needs of the partner. High complementarity suggests a greater potential for a successful trade agreement. Geographic proximity is also an indicator of a high level of trade complementarity, and this leads to what Skiff 2001 termed the natural trading partner hypothesis. Now, to help policymakers leverage a country's comparative advantage, Michael Porter's framework of competitiveness, known as the Trade Can Matrix, quantifies and compares product-level competitiveness. And it does this by looking at products from 4 main categories. So we have rising stars, which are high-growth products with a high level of domestic specialization, declining stars, low-growth products with a high level of domestic specialization, retreats, low-growth products, low domestic specialization, and of course, missed opportunities, right, which are your high growth products with a low level of domestic specialization. And why this is important is because it gives an idea of products or sectors that are in need of economic reform. Historically, our economies have had similar structures. Trinidad and Tobago is a carbon-intensive economy whose main exports are energy-related, petrochemicals, natural gas, crude oil. Non-energy sector diversification is an ongoing ambition of all governments, and currently our main non-energy exports are food and live animals and mineral products such as cement. Traditionally, oil refining and financial services anchored Curaçao's economy. Following closure of the Isla refinery in 2020, there was a structural shift in the export base, which moved from being energy products towards a services-led economy, and today Curaçao's main exports are tourism services. Now, narrowing focus to trade between both countries, historically it has been limited. If we look at graph 1, over 2018 to 2024, Trinidad and Tobago's exports to Curaçao average US 3.8 million. And now this accounts for less than 1% of Trinidad and Tobago's total trade. And our main exports to Curaçao are food and mineral products such as cement. Now, in terms of imports, our imports from Curaçao average US 2.4 million, which is also less than 1% of our total imports, and the main products being medical instruments and transport equipment. Similarly, Curaçao's total trade with Trinidad and Tobago is less than 1%. And now, in looking at chart 2, Curaçao's services exports to Trinidad and Tobago range from a peak of US 27.5 million in 2018 to 9.6 million in 2024. And the main reason for that decline is because of lower exports of transport services. And now Curaçao's main imports of services from Trinidad and Tobago are transport and insurance. For this study, we do not only look at the bilateral trade potential from one perspective, but rather from a complement of methodologies. The data set contains bilateral trade in goods and services between both countries, world trade in goods and services with each country, and also world trade in goods and services. The goods data are disaggregated according to the harmonized 6-digit system, while the services data uses the IMF's balance of payments classification for services. The data were compiled from 5 primary sources, which both central banks, UN Comtrade, the Central Statistical Office of Trinidad and Tobago, and UN Trade and Development. For the analysis of comparative advantage in goods and services, the Balasa 1965 Index of revealed comparative advantage is employed, which we can see in the top left-hand side of the slide. And now, to complement the revealed comparative advantage, the Trade Complementarity Index, the Import Intensity Index, and the Trade Can Matrix were also computed for both countries. So trade complementarity indicates the extent to which the export structure of one will match the import structure, where we utilize the Drysdale 1967 measure. Furthermore, the Import Intensity Index was utilized to identify whether one country had a bias towards imports from the other, where an Import Intensity Index of more than 1 indicates that there is a bias, and less than 1, there is no bias. Lastly, the Trade Can analysis identifies Trinidad and Tobago's specific exports that can be classified according to your rising stars, declining stars, missed opportunities, and retreats in relation to trade with Curaçao, and of course vice versa. In the context of specialization, a rising star indicates that it is a high growth product with a high level of domestic specialization, while a missed opportunity states that the product is a high growth product, but with a low level of domestic specialization.
Thank you, Lauren. Now that we have seen how the analysis was set up, I will first start by comparing the results side by side, and then I will go over to a comparative summary. So first, looking at the Basala revealed comparative advantage and looking at values above 1, we see that about 9% of Trinidad and Tobago's products have a comparative advantage, while for Curaçao's basket of products, about 13% of the products exhibit a comparative advantage. The analysis reveals that Trinidad and Tobago's strengths lie mainly in energy-related and industrial goods such as chemicals, metals, and fuels, while Curaçao's strengths are concentrated in high-value niche exports like textiles, footwear, and prepared foods. On the services side, we see that Trinidad and Tobago stands out in insurance and transport, while Curaçao has a comparative advantage in telecommunications and IT-related services. When we turn to trade complementarity, which, as Lauren already mentioned, measures the degree to which one country's exports match the other country's import needs, we see that alignment fluctuates over time, but it exceeds 1 in several years. For Trinidad and Tobago, if we look to the graph on the left, we see that alignment is the strongest in 2018 and 2023, while Curaçao's trade complementarity with Trinidad is the strongest in 2018 and 2024. Looking at the specific products traded in these years can be beneficial to both countries if a bilateral trade framework were to be established, such as the PSCA. And when we look at the specific products traded in these years, we see that for both countries, the alignment is mainly in products that are processed foods, beverages, manufactured goods, and some selected services. The pattern we see in trade complementarity suggests that while overall trade volumes are still quite low, the two economies already have the right mix of comparative strengths to support greater bilateral trade. Next, we looked at the import intensity index, and when we look at the two graphs, it further reinforces the narrative that existing trade flows already have a built-in bias towards each other's products. If we see the two graphs, again, we see that Trinidad and Tobago on the left-hand side, the consumers from Trinidad and Tobago already show a preference for Curaçaoan products, while Curaçao's import intensity with Trinidad has been increasing in recent years. The results of the import intensity index tells us that even without a formal trade agreement, the foundations for what economists call a natural trading partnership already exist. A natural trading partnership is one where trade can expand naturally without large structural distortions or policy shocks. Lastly, when we apply the TradeCan competitiveness matrix, which helps us identify the products with the strongest future potential, we see that Trinidad and Tobago has 53 rising stars, mostly in processed foods and manufactured goods, and 27 missed opportunities in similar categories. And on the other hand, Curaçao has 39 rising stars and a larger number of missed opportunities, 88 to be exact, mainly in beverages, plastics, and footwear. When we look at services, interestingly, both countries share rising stars in services such as transport, insurance, telecommunications, which point to areas of expansion beyond goods. So altogether, the findings of the TradeCan competitiveness matrix suggest that the proposed PSCA, the Partial Trade Scope Agreement, could deliver tangible mutual benefit if it prioritizes these high potential sectors, the rising stars, and if it addresses the missed opportunities. So when we bring the results together, the contrast between the two economies becomes very clear, but it's actually the contrast that creates real opportunities. From the analysis, a few key points emerged that really capture the essence of both Trinidad and Tobago and Curaçao's trade relationship. First, both Trinidad and Tobago and Curaçao have identifiable rising stars in their export profiles. To recap, these are products where specialization and international demand are growing simultaneously. This is critical because it signals areas where trade can expand naturally under a bilateral trade framework, such as the PSTA. Second, both economies have their own strengths. Trinidad and Tobago has an established industrial and manufacturing base, while Curaçao is positioned in high-value consumer goods. When we look at the Trade Complementarity Index, we see that both countries' export structures are complementary rather than competing. And the Import Intensity Index further confirms that consumers in both economies already have a taste for each other's product, which makes deeper integration even more viable. So both countries show distinct but complementary trade profiles. And while the current trade volumes are still low, the analysis clearly demonstrates that there is potential for growth in both services and goods. So based on these results, we formulate some policy recommendations to enhance bilateral trade and strengthen regional cooperation. First, we propose to broaden the PSTA scope to include products where comparative advantage and import demand align, and this should be supported by targeted tariff reductions. Second, we propose addressing non-tariff barriers by harmonizing import licenses, certification processes, and product standards. Third, we suggest improving transport and port infrastructure to enhance connectivity and reduce shipping costs. Fourth, we suggest streamlining customs and logistics by digitalizing and harmonizing trade procedures. We also suggest facilitating information exchange and technical operation to strengthen institutional capacity and compliance. And lastly, we also suggest advancing digital trade linkages by combining Curaçao's ICT strength with Trinidad and Tobago's industrial base to promote e-commerce and digital services. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, ladies, for sticking within the stipulated time. I now invite Mr. Giancarlo Cruz, who is the Manager of Research of the Central Bank of Aruba. Giancarlo, you have 5 minutes.
Yes, I would like to start by complimenting the authors on a very interesting, relevant, and timely paper, especially given the negotiations that are ongoing between Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago on the partial scope trade agreement. I think this paper and its recommendations can be of added value to the trade negotiators and policymakers. I like that the paper looks to give concrete and practical recommendations on the areas where mutual economic benefits can be maximized. It was also interesting that the paper combines a number of tools for measuring trade competitiveness, including the Balasa revealed comparative advantage and trade complementary indices, as well as the trade competitiveness analysis of nations. I also like that the authors used the revealed symmetrical comparative advantage, the RSCA index, together with the BRCA to account for the asymmetric nature of the BRCA, which is criticized in some of the literature. The paper puts forward some interesting perspectives on post-pandemic structural changes, including adjustments in supply chains, demand for digital services, and evolving trade logistics across the Caribbean. The paper adds to the literature on small state integration by combining traditional trade indices with dynamic analysis. Here and there are some abbreviations that could be specified and some charts that could be clarified somewhat to improve readability. So overall, I thought it was a very well-written paper. I do have some questions and/or suggestions for the authors, starting with the data period chosen. It covers the period 2018-2024, which contains the pandemic period. So I was wondering if you considered maybe doing the exercise also for another period to see if the results are robust or if the pandemic skews the data, or did you maybe take any measures to account for the effects of the COVID pandemic? To quantify the degree of export competitiveness, the study utilized indicators that measure the relative strength of both countries' exports compared to the global average. I was wondering if you maybe also considered measuring the relative strength of the export sectors compared to each other. There were two figures, figures 4 and 9 in the paper, in which bilateral trade numbers for Curaçao and Trinidad and Tobago were shown. I would have expected these numbers to match each other, but they don't. So I was wondering why is this? I was thinking it may have to do with re-exports being included in Curaçao's export numbers. Also, in the results and analysis section, I could not find the results for the RSCA, only for the BRCA. So I was wondering if this was done consciously, or and what is the reason then for that? The analysis includes goods that are re-exported. I was wondering how would the picture change if the re-exports were excluded, or perhaps if re-exports could be treated as one export category instead of separate export categories for each exported good. I think that this may give a truer picture of the comparative advantage for Curaçao especially. The paper also mentions high RCA values for Curaçao in telecommunications, computer and information services, reflecting Curaçao's increasing role as a regional provider of digital and communication services. To what extent do you think is the growth in tourism sector a driver for this? As more tourists may also be making use of these services. So those were my questions and comments. But again, congratulations on a very interesting and well-written paper.
Yeah, thank you, Giancarlo. So I think we will open up the floor to some questions now, and then, ladies, we'll give you some time towards the end to answer some of them, right? So the floor is open. Okay, so they're probably thinking about it. So probably you guys could go through next.
First of all, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yes, thank you very much for the thorough questions. And in fact, you pointed out some of the things that, we also had some challenges with in terms of the paper, right? So one of the main ones being the differences in the trade data. So that took us a while to try to align. So what we noticed is that the data that we source from our Central Statistical Office versus the data that Curaçao sources from their bureau did not align. And we did try to drill deeper into that in terms of contacting the different agencies to find out what could possibly cause these distortions. But it almost seems as if it comes down to how the trade data is collected. Perhaps it has some differences in classification of the trade data, which is a whole, I guess would be a bit of a challenge to then have to figure out what the root cause of these differences are. The In terms of the RSCA, when we looked at the results, I mean, they were similar in terms of the BRCA and the RSCA. So yes, it was computed. It was not included in the paper, but it is something that we could look at including. And in terms of re-exports, no, that's a good point, because ideally, re-exports should not be included in calculating comparative advantage, because you want to look at what you produce and how well you export what you produce. So that is something that, I guess, as we relook the paper, is something that should be excluded, in fact, from the calculation. Yeah.
Thank you, Giancarlo, for your comments. And one thing that Lauren already addressed is the re-export, and we did discuss that maybe doing another calculating the indices again without the re-exports. To answer your question about how do I think the growth in tourism drives the advantage we have in telecommunications and IT-related services. So the comparative advantage, I do think it somewhat drives this advantage, but Curaçao also has an established, I think, IT infrastructure. And just this morning, also in the news, I read that we're working again on expanding our linkages with the region to put internet cables that furthermore will contribute to this telecommunications advantage we have in the services sector. But we also, I think in the paper, tourism did stand out in other sectors, such as transport was one also where we had a comparative advantage in.
Okay, thank you, ladies. So before Kalan, and I think there's one person behind. Okay, okay, we have very limited time now. But one question I had, there are three things, but they all center around the fact that yes, comparative advantages are important determinant that goes into the discussion about when you're having a partial scope agreement or even an EP, right? But there are other things that goes into it, things like revenue neutrality, for example, things like how to consider rules of origin. You mentioned things like re-exports, which is in that vein. And also, you remember that if you have an EPA between Trinidad and Tobago and Curaçao, Trinidad and Tobago will have to go and get a no objection from all the other members of CARICOM. So in that light, it might be useful to have the comparative advantage, measure comparative advantage of the entire region, including Curaçao. So, Kalan? All right. Is there any other question? I think we have about 2 minutes if my timing is, how many minutes do we have? 1 minute. Okay. Okay, so okay, we have 1 minute, so I think we'll end things. So I want you to join with me in thanking not only the presenters but Giancarlo for their enlightening discussion.
And just like that, we concluded session 3 and the first day of the conference. We would like to thank every presenter, discussant, chair, and participant for a very insightful and successful first day. Before we move on to the welcome and networking cocktail hour, I would like to inform you that at 6 o'clock, there will be a bus at the lobby for the ones staying at Courtyard Marriott and Harbor Hotel. And also, tomorrow's pickup times will be 10 past 8 at Courtyard Marriott and 20 past 8 at Harbor Hotel. And also, you can still sign up for the Adelaide Brown Memorial Lecture for tomorrow evening and the Art Walk on Friday. Thank you again. Enjoy the networking cocktail hour and see you all tomorrow again. Thank you.